welcome to this month's HN Reads, where we bring a fantastic author of horse books here onto Horse Network to talk to them about all things riding and horses, of course. This month, you have an extra special treat. We have Elizabeth Letts, who wrote the New York Times bestselling book, $80 Champion, which you probably have on your shelf. She also wrote another horse book called The Perfect Horse, which is about the Lipizzaners, as well as a book about the Wizard of Oz and Dorothy. Today, she's going to come on and talk about her newest horse book, her third one. It's right here. It's beautiful. It's a slightly different story than her other ones. It's called The Ride of Her Life. And please welcome her on. Welcome on, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. So the first thing I would like to hear from you is a little bit of who the main character is and what this book is about, because I know that you will do it the best.
Well, I'm really excited to introduce you to my new character, Annie Wilkins. She is really a one-of-a-kind woman who undertook an adventure in 1954 that it's an inspiring equestrian adventure. It's also a peek into kind of another way of life. So the book is called The Ride of Her Life, and Annie Wilkins, she was 62 years old. She lived up on a farm in Maine, rural Maine, kind of at the end of a dirt road. She had lost her farm to back taxes. She also had been given 2 to 4 years to live. So basically, Annie had nothing going for her whatsoever. And she was offered a spot at the charity home to, just go kind of sit in a rocker and wait to die, basically. And she was like, I don't think that's how I want to spend the last years of my life. So she didn't have a car. She didn't have money for bus fare. She had never been on an airplane or really thought about that. But she knew how to ride a horse. And so she took what little money she had, took her little dog, went and found herself a horse named Tarzan, and decided to set off from Maine to see if she could just ride all the way to California to see the Pacific Ocean just once before she died.
Oh, I loved it so much. One of the things that I was really impressed with is that often books of narrative nonfiction, especially historical narrative nonfiction, have a habit of not being able to pick up the story and tell the story really fully. And I was wondering how you got the pages to turn so quickly, because I just wanted to know everything that happened to Annie all the time.
Narrative nonfiction, so I write both. I write true stories and I write fiction. And there is a real hunger for true stories. I think there's something, you can read about a story in fiction and you can maybe be inspired by it and find it interesting. But when you know that the story is true, it has a special power, because then you look at it and you think, oh, well, if this person did this thing, it kind of makes it feel like maybe you could, maybe not do what they do, but it would open the door to the possibilities in your own life. And it just has this authenticity when it's true. So this is a true story, but it is much harder to write in terms of craft, to make the pages turn, to make sure that the reader is both engaged in the story and also that you build a world around this character and these horses, and you introduce people to this world. So when I write a story, I'm always trying to have those 2 layers. So the first layer is this compelling story about a woman and her animals and this kind of unbelievable quest. But then you need to know something about the world that produced this woman. What was the world like at that time? What did it look like from her perspective, and what does it look like to us looking back? And then you need to weave that in such a way that your reader just doesn't get lost in, if you're doing it right, the facts and the history sort of flow so naturally from the story that you don't feel bogged down like you're reading a textbook.
One of the other things that I think you kind of touched on a little bit that you just said, but I wanted to build more on, is the character of Annie. And how Annie's true story really affected you and inspired you. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, when you write, you get very immersed in these characters' lives. And in my case, very often the people that I write about, most of the time, they're real people. And so it's a very fascinating process to get to know a person. You get to know them so deeply. Sometimes you get to know them better than people who knew them because you know more about them. And in the case of Annie, she's not a typical hero. Some of my other books have been written about people that you would say would be more kind of typical heroes. Like I wrote about the Second Cavalry in the World War II and Colonel Reed and these very, bigger than life characters. Annie Wilkins is just the opposite. Annie Wilkins, if you saw her walking down the street, you might not give her the time of day. She was a little bit older. She was 62 when the story starts. She wasn't very tall, wasn't very pretty, especially. She wasn't too slim, or just kind of anything that we associate with the kinds of characters that we write stories about. And yet, as you start to dig into the character of Annie, what you find is that she has this incredible heroism to her, this courage and this grit, this bravery, and this really compelling kind of persistence that is so inspiring. And you ask yourself, why this woman? Why? What was it in her that made her see a broader horizon for herself? And then by extension, well, what does that mean to me? If this woman could not be held back by fear, what is holding me back? What fears are holding me back? And Annie affected me very deeply that way, especially because I was writing about her during the pandemic, when I was kind of closed in and couldn't do very much and spent a lot of time at home. And here's this woman off on this kind of epic quest. It was very interesting for me to kind of contemplate her and what she meant, sort of to me and to the readers by extension.
One of the things that I thought a lot about as I was reading is how Annie kind of feels similar to like the patron saint of many current horse owners. Like I read a statistic once that the average American horse owner is a woman over 50. I don't know. I have to fact check that again. So please, dearest audience, you're welcome to fact check it for me. It's been a while since I checked that number, but I thought about that a lot as I was reading. And how do you think Annie and this particular audience might connect to one another?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because Annie, I wrote the $80 Champion about Harry DeLayer, an amazing champion, and sadly we lost him last week. But he was an incredible horseman. And then I wrote about the Spanish riding school and Alois Podolsky and these incredibly advanced dressage riders. Annie Wilkins is much more like us, and she's much more relatable. She loves her animals. She considers them companions. She's an okay rider, but she didn't take equitation classes as a child. She grew up around horses and came to her knowledge of them very organically as a farm woman. And she has this deep affection. She says a lot of times in the story that sometimes she likes her animals better than people, particularly her two ex-husbands. But that what the animals give her, that deep bond with her animals, and that bond with her animals that really you can see as the story unfolds. They gave each other kind of the courage and the ability to finish this incredible story. I think a lot of us really feel that way. And a lot of writers, we may picture that we're jumping snowman over a 6-foot obstacle, but in reality we're kind of walking on the trail or doing as we do. And a lot of our relationship with our animals is that contact and friendship that we have with them. And I do think that's very, very relatable for a lot of people. Not even if you're not old. I mean, it's really interesting. I've gotten some really sweet letters from people who are young readers, but it's just that courage, that idea that like, I'm going to see if I can just do what I want to do without being afraid.
Well, the fact that she's sick too, like a lot of the times, like trekking novel or trekking memoirs, this one's not a memoir, obviously this is a biography, but often the person is super, super young and super, super fit. And this is like a completely different character. Like, and she's like super strong and a total badass, but she's not who you normally picture when you think about like Wild or On the Trail of Genghis Khan. Like that.
Like, let me take a minute to kind of, help you picture her on horseback. So she was one of the things I just loved about Annie. I don't like to tell people how much I weigh. Well, Annie was happy to tell you she weighed 170 pounds. Well, she was 5 feet tall. She was kind of square, very strong. She had worked her entire life, cropped gray hair, and she dressed in men's clothes for comfort. She wore men's dungarees, loose and baggy. She would wear a flannel shirt. And when she left Maine, she left in November, so she kind of just put on a bunch of layers of clothes. She had a union suit on. Over that, she had 4 pairs of men's jeans. Sometimes she said 2, sometimes 4. She didn't even have a raincoat. I mean, she was wearing an Army-Navy surplus, the big old pea coat kind of thing. And she had this bonnet with fur-lined flaps that her grandmother had given her. She had saddlebags from the Sears and Roebuck catalog, and she had an old McClellan saddle that she had kind of stripped down, but it was then something to sit in. She had left so little for her not ample bum that she kind of had to squeeze into it. So she cut kind of a picture, and I think sometimes also for horsewomen, it's like we do think about, we can feel self-conscious. Are we, how do we look in the saddle? Do we look, this or that? And I mean, none of that for Annie. She was just going to do what she was going to do.
I love that, like, about her too. Like, it's just like she's like, I'm leaving now. Okay, bye. I also think that first the when we very first meet the horse she gets, that there's some of that in that particular horse too. Can you describe him for us?
Well, she didn't have much money. I mean, she didn't have any money. I mean, she had sold some cucumbers for pickling, which she had gathered up. She never said exactly how much, but it was, $100 and something and some change. And she wanted to buy a horse. And the funny thing was, her mother used to talk about someday they'd hitch up a buggy and drive to California. Well, this was because Annie was born in the 1890s, back when people would actually sometimes travel west, in the pioneer, kind of the end of that era. But she didn't have enough money for a buggy, so she decides she's just going to get a horse. She looks through the classified ads, and she finally finds a little classified ad that is for a stable that's selling off its summer horses because it's Maine, and they're going to sell them off. And the man is kind of soft-hearted, so he buys horses that would otherwise go to the butcher, but then he has to turn around and sell them. So it's not a high-class establishment, shall we say. She goes over there and she sees Tarzan. Now, Tarzan is a really interesting horse. He was about 14, probably 14.2, 14.3. He was brown all over. He had no white markings whatsoever, black points. But he was just to take a look at him, he was clearly a Morgan, a very typical breed for New England. It's the native breed of Vermont. And he was a good-looking horse. You really, if you look at him with modern eyes, he had clean legs, he had strong haunches, he had a nice sloped shoulder. He really was conformationally sound in that compact way that Morgans are sometimes. But when Annie saw him, it was really funny. She took a look at him and she saw something of herself in him. She was like, well, I'm kind of short and square, a New Englander, and he's kind of short and square, and he's a New Englander. But she also thought she could see that he was a little bit of a rogue. He had this forelock that was kind of long, black, but kind of, how they get tinged, kind of rust-colored at the end, and swooped across his eyes in this kind of handsome manner. And he reminded her of, like, the boys asking the girls out to, like, go to the dance in town. So she liked him, and she got on him, and she sat on him, and it really was one of those kind of love at first sight sort of things. So she was smitten. She wanted this horse. And she was all prepared to bargain. And the guy's like, well, this horse was a racehorse. They used to run the Morgans in trotting races in the county fairs. So Annie's like, well, I kind of need a quiet horse. I don't know if I really need a, racehorse. And he's like, oh, actually, he was at a summer camp. Well, she just kind of like at that point, I mean, have you ever been in this position? Because honestly, I have been in this position. You don't care. You're just giving them the money. So she bought Tarzan and didn't know much about him. But, in a way, she was really lucky because he really was unusually well built and suited to endurance. But in another way, she wasn't so lucky because he was afraid of trucks. So every time they saw a truck all the way, across that country, that time of riding, every time a big old truck came down, he would spook. So, Yeah,
every time I would read one of those scenes where the truck would go by, I would flinch because I thought of the times that, like, I have ridden down the road. My childhood, I would ride down, like, a canyon road, and there was only, like, a little tiny bit of a shoulder. And I I could imagine Annie's particular circumstance, like, perfectly in my head. And I'm like, oh, please no big truck while I get around the blind spot.
Down and you're just going, please, please, please,
Mm-hmm. I also
so
think
managed to hang on.
Yeah. But I also loved the way that Annie's adventure also coincided with the rise of automobiles, and how the post-war car boom became a major part of the American psyche, the way we live now.
Yes.
And I was wondering what it was like to write about that.
Well, so actually, I grew up in Los Angeles, and the freeway was a fact of life. It was already there when I grew up. So I guess I never really thought about roads very much. They're just they were just recent enough that it wasn't something we were going to learn about in history. And so they were just there, concrete and roads. And sure, I mean, I knew that that there weren't roads at some point, but it's hard to imagine the country without it. So what was so fascinating when I looked into the story of Annie, the way I approach a story, I don't go in with this idea that somehow I'm going to um, make the story mean this or make it mean that. I look at the story and then I kind of go out a little and I think, well, what was going on at that time? So what was going on at the time of Annie's ride was the coming of the interstate, which was really changing our country. So the mid 1950s, a little bit before my time, was a time of really, really rapid change. And the most rapid change was the car. One of the most interesting things I discovered in the 1954, 1955, 1 in 6 Americans was employed in the automobile industry. 1 in 6. And the car was just going crazy. So, it used to be, it was kind of a luxury good. A lot of country people did not have them. A lot of city people didn't have them. But as they started to build the suburbs after the war, people started having the family car. And then pretty soon it was like, oh, but maybe the wife should have a car. And so we were just building them and coming off. Well, but all those cars had to go somewhere. And so they decided to build the interstate. And as they were building the interstate, it really, when you really look at it, you start to realize what a different country we became before and after. Very, very fascinating.
Um, I hope I have this correct, and holler if this is way too much of a deep cut that's too nerdy. But I also kept thinking about the highway map she used. Can you talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, well, it's funny how things like go from being very ordinary to being extremely weird in a short period of time. So when I set out to research this story, I needed to try to trace Annie's route. She started off in Maine, and how do you trace a route in modern day society? Google Maps, right? So I started just using Google Maps to get her from one place to another. And as I did that, it didn't make any sense. You couldn't get from point A. Why would she go that way? So finally, I thought, I'm going to have to go back and look at maps the way that they were at the time that she was writing. Well, that was those old gas station maps that you would go to the Shell Oil and, you would ask for directions and then they would have a map and the little, fold out like an accordion. And they were real compendiums of information. They had, some of them told you how to make a hand signal, if you didn't have directionals on your car. They would tell you the mileage between points. A lot of people will remember it was like a grid and you could trace down Albuquerque and then you go across to, St. Louis or something and it would tell you how many miles. So they're very fascinating. And as I started looking at those maps, I started to understand more why Annie's route took the way that it did. One of the things, when she started, she didn't have a map and she wasn't a very educated person. So she didn't really have any sense of the distances or really where she was headed. But what was so fascinating to me is she never had a map of the whole United States. She started getting these little section maps and people would hand her a map and they'd be like, take this road, take that road, and she would follow them. But when you see the entire route, which at the end of the book, there's a map that shows, where she went the whole way. Then you think, oh, okay, well, I understand why she did this because she never really knew how to get from one point to another. Just she only knew the local way. But it was also really revealing to look at the old maps because it made me understand how in 1955 we were a country of small towns and roads didn't just zoom past small towns. The town was kind of the hub of the roads, and then the roads went out in a spoke. They were called farm to market roads. So basically farmers would go into town and then they'd go back to the farm. And that's what our roads look like. So there wasn't a good way, so you had to kind of hop from town to town. And you couldn't tell which town was really more important than any other one. It was just a whole bunch of towns. Now, if you look at a map, first of all, you're not going to look at a map. You're going to look at Google Maps. And no matter how hard you try, it's going to route you on the interstate. So it's very interesting.
The other thing that I was also super captivated as I was reading is that one of the things I've noticed about good animal books is they often are able to capture the animals themselves on the page and make them into characters. Like if you think about James Herriot does this super, super well. That book Marley and Me, which is about dogs, right? Does that super, super well. And that ability to capture a character, an animal as a character, is often, I think, makes or break a horse book. especially one that's super narrative like this. How did you do that? What is that like to do? What is the trick? Is there a
Well,
trick?
I mean, there's sort of two parts. So one of them is don't write animal books if you don't love animals. Don't write horse books if you don't not only like horses but really know them inside and out. You know, you and I because I started riding as a kid and I was able to keep horses at home the whole time that I was growing up, and so I have many horse hours. And I've always been I can't draw anything. I can draw a horse. You know. Um, so you have to really have an understanding of animal behavior, and you have to, I believe, really resist the urge to make a horse a person. You know, a horse isn't a person. A horse has its own dignity, and a horse has its own personality and its own way of engaging with the world. For a horse to really be presented accurately, that horse has to act like a horse, not like a person. So that's kind of part of it. You have to really pay attention, and you have to know those kinds of details about horses or dogs, animals. It means that you're watching them, listening to them, and you know what they do. The second part is really a matter of craft, and I think with writing, it takes a lot of patience. You have to write and rewrite and write and rewrite and get a lot of feedback so that your words become easy to digest. And my favorite thing that a person could tell me was that my book was really easy to read, that it felt natural, that it kind of sped right through it. And how I do that is by, going over it and just taking out the words you don't need so that you're not like, stumbling over them. And that is just a lot of hard work, I guess.
Yeah, I also meant to audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the comment section. We would love to hear from you and answer your questions. So please let us know. So you talked a little bit about your own experiences with horses, but I would love to hear way more. We have someone who just bought the book on Amazon. Fabulous.
Oh, lovely. I hope you enjoy it. So my experience with my favorite subject, what horse girl doesn't just want to talk about horses? So, my story, my mom was a city girl, grew up in Brooklyn, and she loved horses. And my mom actually went to the National Horse Show as a little girl. So I grew up with a mom who loved horses so much that she went off to the barn to try to learn how to ride as an adult. I was a little girl, and so I just tagged along. But I had a really lucky thing happen, which was that when I was about 9 years old, my parents decided to move we lived in Los Angeles, but we're kind of outside the city back when there were still kind of horses all around outside the city. And so we started keeping our horses at home. And I just, from that time period, I sort of just did everything. I was in pony club, I did hunter jumper showing, but I had also trails that I could ride on. I tried my hand at gymkhana and barrel racing. I had this really lovely little mare who would just do anything. And I wanted to train her on the wire. I was obsessed with the Foxfield drill team. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they were a drill team in California where kids would train, and they would have it would look like free riding, but they actually had like a sort of a thick wire that was there just in case they needed to it wasn't, punitive or anything, but you could sort of steer with it. Well, my horse wouldn't I put the wire on, take off all the bridle and saddle, and off I would go. And I was kind of really a daredevil. Like I would jump anything. But I was so lucky because it was a community in which there were many, many horses and ponies of all kinds. We would go down to the public riding ring, and then we would all just swap horses and have jump offs and things. So it was the most idyllic kind of childhood. As I went along, I got really involved in eventing, and I evented competitively through my teens. And then as an adult, I really moved into other things. And it really was the writing, interestingly enough, that drew me back into riding. When I wrote the $80 Champion, people started saying, "Hey, do you want to come ride with me in this unbelievable place?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't really ride that much anymore." And they'd be like, "Nonsense, once and always." And so I started riding again. So I'm kind of an adult re-rider at this point.
Ooh, can you share a place that you've been? Is there one you can share?
One of the really fun ones was I went with the author Rita Mae Brown, who writes mysteries about fox hunting country. And she's also a master of foxhounds in Virginia. She has this just unbelievable farm. And we went out with, it was so funny. I was introduced by this really lovely woman who's also a writer, and she worked for my publisher, Penguin Random House. So we went out and we got on the horses and we take off. And pretty soon, Rita Mae Brown is like a very, very strong rider. And she starts going like, taking off over the fences. And this Penguin Random House person who's supposed to be kind of corralling me, she's going like, oh my God, if I get you killed, I'm going to get in so much trouble. But it was fine.
The publisher's going to be so mad. That's amazing. So now you have to tell me about this mare. You have to tell me what kind of horse was it? How big was it? What was she like? What color?
My horse. Well, I mean, I had many, many horses, but Kim was kind of the sort of my all around horse of my heart when I was a child, from about 10 to 13. She was half quarter horse, half thoroughbred. I believe that, I mean, I don't know, my mom bought her sight unseen. It was one of these things. And she came down from Washington State, and it was like, it could have been such a disaster, right? And she brings her down, and she was black with a white star, and she was just the most good-natured horse of all time. So she really was the perfect horse for me. I started pony clubbing on her. Then I started showing on her, and I showed she was quite a good jumper. So I rode hunter jumpers, but at the same time, literally, like when we would have the local show and they would have a pole bending or barrel racing or something. And this was at a very low level for anybody out there who's a real champion, barrel race or anything. But still, that's it. I would take off my English stuff, throw on the Western stuff, and off I would go. And she would just put up with all of it. She was such a great horse. And then we bred her. And she had one foal who was a half Connemara. And the interesting little tidbit of that, if you have any aficionados of older equestrian writers, the woman who owned the sire of that we bred our horse to was an equestrian writer named Dorothy Lyons. And she has kind of a following. She has kind of a cult following. She wrote a series of books back in the, I think, 40s and 50s. Anyway, so we bred my mare Kim. And then her foal, Casey, we had her up all the way. I mean, she lived for a very long time, 35, 40 years, I think. And we kept her through her whole life. And
she lived a long time. That's forever.
Yeah, she was. I think I was a teenager when we bred her, but then we kept Casey. Casey was never as good as Kim. Casey was a little bit of a brat because she was more my mom's horse, and so I was always giving my mom a hard time, saying, well, "You're not as good a rider as me. You never taught her to." But we kept Kim's full Casey for many, many years.
Wow, it sounds like she was almost your Tarzan. Like she's the same color.
Yeah, she kind of looked a little bit like him. She had that same. I love, growing up and riding in the 60s, 70s when I started. There were so many great, just kind of like grade horses. The good old grade horse, and that's what I always. I mean, I rode a lot of different horses, and Kim, she was supposedly quarter horse thoroughbred, but really she was just a horse, just a great horse. And Tarzan kind of reminded me that same kind of horse.
Mm-hmm. All right, now we get to do it. Now I really want to talk about the other horse that shows up in the book. His name is Rex. He's a Tennessee Walker. Please tell me about Rex.
Sure. Well, maybe this would be a good time to show a picture.
Oh yeah,
from the book. Here we go. So what you have in this picture, I really particularly love this picture. So that's Annie Wilkins. She always had a smile on her face, and she's got Tarzan there. When she got to Tennessee, she realized that Tarzan was really carrying more weight than he should have because she was both riding him and using him as a pack horse. So as she was riding through Tennessee, she wanted to buy another horse, but she couldn't find one because she really basically had no money. And these really nice people decided that it would be fun to give her this horse, Rex, who was a Tennessee Walker. And so Rex is the horse on the right with the screen with the white star and the white snip. He was, and they just said, you can have him, but wherever you go, make sure you tell everybody that he's a Tennessee Walker, and it'll bring great publicity to our state and to the breed. So, and then you can also see in this picture, Dépêche-toi, which means hurry up. And that was her little mutt who went every step of the way with her. He liked to ride on Tarzan a lot of the time. And I especially love this picture because you see the Texaco sign in the background, because Annie and the horses spent a lot of time stopping at filling stations. They would go to gas stations to get water, and they didn't need gas, obviously. But by the time they were riding across the country, it was easier to find a gas station sometimes than a stable. So
Yeah, I like that. The picture's so amazing. One of the other things that you mentioned in the book is the how there was a memoir published. I think it's a memoir published by Annie herself. Like she helped kind of collaborate it, but it doesn't talk about the other marriages and things like that. What was it like to dig that stuff up and write about it? Like finding
yeah,
the gene.
so she published a book called "The Last of the Saddle Tramps" in the 1960s, and it's kind of a misconception. I've had some readers say, "Oh, the book is in Annie's own word," but actually, the book was written by a woman named Mina Titus Sawyer, who I talk about in my book, who was a journalist and a really cool person in her own right. She was also a big animal lover, and she had also adopted a daughter as a single mother during the Great Depression, just because she felt like she could give someone a good home. She was always adopting people and animals, and she kind of adopted Annie. I talk about her in the book. Um, she started following Annie's story as Annie was leaving Maine, and then she helped Annie sort of get attention, publicity, and eventually Mina was the one who was able to get this the story called "The Last of the Saddle Tramps" into print. So I used that as a reference. I was very lucky because I was given the rights to the book, so that I was able to use from the memoirs as freely as I could by Mina Titus Sawyer's daughter. And it was a really good resource. But back in those days, they were less picky about whether things were true or not true. So the Last of the Saddle Tramps, it's a little bit of a mix between things that actually happened and things that really weren't quite accurate when I was able to research them using other sources. So I used her memoir, and then, but I did dig in a lot to, one of the things that you find really interesting about Annie is they used to refer to her as she was traveling across the country as the Widow Wilkins, because that was sort of a polite way to describe an older woman. In the 1950s, there really wasn't a good way to be an older woman if you were single. You could be, an esteemed widow, you could be a mother, you could be a sister or a daughter, but just kind of like a woman on her own, that was kind of something that would raise a little suspicion. And so turns out Annie had been married twice. She was no kind of widow. And she was perfectly fine to admit that. She would talk about what had happened with her marriages. She was a very independent woman. So she married young, the first person who I won't tell you exactly, and I didn't really ever find out too much about him, but it was a difficult marriage and they got divorced. And then she lived and worked as an independent woman for a very long time. When she was older, she remarried. And there was a lot of pressure on women in those days because it was like either you live with your parents or you marry. So I think maybe her parents were kind of like, maybe you better marry this guy. She married him, and not too long after, she inherited the rights to this farm that had been in her family. And the man was like, okay, well, I'm the husband, so I get the deed on the farm. And she was like, I'm the woman, and I inherited this from my grandmother, and you can't have it. And he ran off, and that was the end of him. So, yeah, it was interesting. It was like, though, I don't know if painful is the right word, but again, Annie's not the kind of person that people frequently write books about. And yet she's the kind of person that has populated our country and made it what it is. She was just a hardworking person. She tried to make it as a farmer. She was very badly affected in the Great Depression and really never recovered. It's like from the time of the Great Depression to the time she lost her farm, that was just years of struggle where they tried to hold on to this way of life that was so kind of iconic, the small farm and you support yourself. And so to see that, just the hardship in her life, and to understand how hard she had worked, and then to see how much, I don't know, love and enthusiasm and burning desire to do something that she had left over, it was very inspiring to me.
Mm-hmm. She's also super nuanced too. Like in some instances, she's pretty rough and very kind of in your face, and then others she's like super sweet almost, and like in tears and very grateful and easy to get along with. And it seems like there's just like, they say in each of us there's a universe, and it's definitely the case in this particular character, and especially if, an older woman in the 50s is not usually portrayed that way.
Yes.
So
Yes.
she
You
also,
could just
yeah.
easily go ahead. Oh, I was just going to
No,
say
go,
she's the
go,
kind of
go.
person you could easily underestimate, that I think most people, and I'm not saying in the 1950s, I'm saying today, you know, you walk down the street and you see Annie Wilkins and she's kind of not dressed that nice, and she's, and you're going to just, and she wasn't very educated. You might just write her off. But she was a very accomplished person. First of all, just to know that much about animals and about farming and about how to survive in the world, that's a kind of knowledge that we don't necessarily value in the same way as we used to. But it's not book smart, but she was still a very smart person. And as far as her temperament, she was tough against adversity. But I had the good fortune, as I did my research, of meeting people who had met her along the way. And they universally described her as raucously funny and really, really kind and interesting. So people enjoyed, as she goes along her journey, she meets people and they extend these kindnesses to her. And I thought, well, maybe she came across as kind of eccentric. And I think she was eccentric, because most old ladies didn't do what she did. But as far as people really liked her, they said she was a great storyteller. She was also, though, she would curse and she would drink and she was fun. She liked a good party. She wasn't a tame kind of like, quiet little person. And that was something that was harder to express about a person in those days publicly. It was impolite to describe someone that way, really.
You used earlier the term saddle tramp. Can you describe a saddle tramp?
Yeah, a saddle tramp is kind of like a subset of the hobo. And what was really interesting when I was researching the sort of the concept of the hobo and the tramp is that the whole idea was they were homeless in a way, and Annie was homeless. I mean, she had lost her farm, but the idea was that you were going to move and then work, move and then work, move and then work. And so a saddle tramp, again, that would be somebody mounted on a horse who was going to move along and work to support themselves. It was a very independent thing. But the saddle tramp, it's really interesting if you look at the 1950s. So most of us who have familiarity with or interest in TV, the 1950s television, that was the Western. It was Gunsmoke and all kinds of other shows. So people were sitting in their little suburban living rooms, looking at the Lone Ranger and the cowboys going out onto the range. It was people couldn't get enough of that, and the idea of this lone person who was independent and not controlled by anybody was so popular at that time. And I believe it was because that kind of symbolized a way of life that people understood that they were losing. More people worked for companies and commuted, lived in the suburbs. They were really moving toward this more modern life, and they mourned that loss of that, ride your horse off into the sunset, into this place where there weren't people. So the way that Annie actually got the name Saddle Tramp, she gave it to herself. She was in Kansas, and the city of Dodge City, Kansas, the Chamber of Commerce, all across the country, sometimes these Chamber of Commerces would reach out to her and say, why don't you come to our town? Why don't you come to our town? Well, Dodge City, she didn't actually go there, but they were really interested in having her come there because she was going to be the last of the saddle tramps, and they wanted to claim that Dodge City was the cowboy capital of America. And so she started referring herself to that at that point as the saddle tramp.
That's so I think it's such a good term, and I love how she takes it and it kind of becomes this thing that embodies her in this positive way, kind of like how some people claim other terms in ways that sometimes this term can seem as derogatory, but instead it's no, I am this thing.
Well, she called herself a tramp of fate, and then she started calling herself a saddle tramp. And I mean, I kind of want to be a saddle tramp. I mean, don't we all kind of? I'd say every horse person, there's been a time when we thought, I got a horse, maybe I should just go.
Yeah. So that actually leads perfectly into my next question. I know that Annie definitely made a lot of her pocket money through these cards that you'd sell people, but she couldn't sell those today. They would be Instagram photos, right? She'd have to get ask for a buck for each Instagram photo. And do you think that there could be Annies of today, and what would that look like? Or is it not? Is she a creature of her time, right? Because people would open their doors, and that was one of those shocking things that made her story quite a bit different from many of the other trekking kind of books that I've read is there's lots of hospitality in the trekking books, but like they seem to like love Annie. And I was wondering if that is
well,
period or if that is Annie, like,
I
or
think,
neither.
I think that this story is a story of a time and a place, the place being America and the time being the mid 1950s. And it is really, I find myself as a historian and as an author, I'm fascinated by these kind of turning points in history where you're really entering into a new period. And Annie is just kind of this almost 19th century person who grew up on a farm at the end of a dirt road, um, with a set of expectations. She basically rides her way into mid 1950s America, which is rapidly changing into something else. And um, so I think I've had some interesting conversations about whether it would be possible to do her journey now. It would be so different. And I hope that that is a lesson that people take from the story is we are not used to simply taking things on faith anymore. And the real message that came through to me in Annie's story is what would happen if you just weren't afraid and you really could just go and say, she used to say, I'll bury me where I drop. Like she had been given this diagnosis of 2 to 4 years. She didn't know if she was going to make it. She had this faith, this kind of just blind faith in like whatever was going to happen was going to happen. Now we plan and we make contingency plans and we have cell phones and we have GPSs and yes, things can still go wrong, but we wouldn't tolerate that level of risk in our lives, I don't think. But I do think that it's really helpful and instructive to think, well, but why not? Maybe are we too cautious now? And when people come back to me and say, well, people just aren't the same anymore, I guess I think people are more the same than we think they are. But in one fundamental way, we really are different, which is we really are much more afraid to just kind of do things. Some of that's good. In terms of our animals, I think we've become more conscious of how to keep them safe, and that's necessary. But at the same time, you kind of think, well, this is really interesting. Look what happens to a person when they just, maybe at the end of reading the book, the answer is not to get your horse and try to ride back across the country, but to kind of say, well, what is the thing that is within my power to change, but fear is holding me back? That's what I would like people to ask themselves after reading Annie's story.
You also mentioned really early in the interview that you were working on this during the pandemic, and the pandemic itself was a time of deep uncertainty. And I think in a level we're still there. Would you say that Annie taught you about uncertainty during the pandemic? Did they kind of go together?
Yeah. I've never been as personally influenced by a character as I was by Annie. And I've written about some really extraordinary people. But there was something about that juxtaposition. I went out on my last research trip in February of, it was almost March. And I originated in Los Angeles, and I actually saw some people wearing masks at the time, but it was just so not on my radar. But I had to cut that research trip short and come home. And then all the rest of the process of finishing the book, I was really, just like we all were, kind of hunkered down. And I didn't know, none of us really knew where we were headed or how we were going to come out of it. So I took a great amount of solace from her story. I started thinking a lot, what would Annie do? I still think that, what would Annie do? What do I want my life to be when I come out of this? What am I holding back on? What am I afraid to do? Am I really going for the life I want? And again, I think in my case, it was pretty radical because I ended up moving from Los Angeles to rural Wyoming, largely because I had spent a lot of time in Wyoming researching her book and realized that was really what I want. But, many people, the changes that they make in their life wouldn't necessarily be dramatic like that in terms of location, but in terms of what's inside you, it can really be dramatic. She's a really great role model for women. She's a really great role model for older women, but really for any woman or any person who thinks, I would if I could, but I don't know. What if you just did it,
Right. What if you just leave and let it catch you? Looks like we have a question from the audience. Let's see what it is. How long did Annie survive, and did she get to the coast? I don't know. I don't know if we should give away the ending, yo.
Yeah. Well, those are, I mean, the one thing I can definitely say, I mean, is that the 2 to 4 years that she had to live, I don't know if it was the healthy air, or I don't know, or if it was just the fact that she refused to give up on herself, but Annie actually lived quite a long life.
Yeah, you'll have to read the book and find out. So I have one last question, because I think ending on the idea of leaping for the next thing is a perfect place to end, and a perfect way to continue on, post pandemic, hopefully. What are you working on next? All of us are waiting with bated breath, of course.
Yeah, well, it's always one and on to the next one. So I have been going back and forth between fiction, nonfiction, and historical fiction, and I am writing a book. This is fiction, but it actually it takes place at the end of World War I. It's set in a veterinary hospital, and that's all I can tell you right now. And I haven't even finished writing it yet, so don't know when it'll be published. A couple of years, probably.
Ooh, we get an inside scoop for the day. Fabulous.
Yeah.
All right. I thank you all for coming. Please check out Elizabeth Letz's new book and her old ones. They are fabulous. They will speak to the horse person in all of you. And even if you're not a horse person, they are absolutely fantastic. Thank you again, Elizabeth.
Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you. There's one more thing that I wanted to say is I do have young adult versions of the 2 books, The $80 Champion and The Perfect Horse, and they're suitable for younger readers. But also there is a picture book forthcoming about The $80 Champion that I'm really excited about. So,
cool. Can you tell us a little bit more? Do you know who's illustrating it?
Yeah, it's already in the works, and I've seen some of the illustrations, and it's just gorgeous, stunning, beautiful, and it'll be.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait.
Yeah, I'm not sure when it's coming out, 2022, I think. But I'll keep you posted.
Oh yeah, I can't wait to see it. That's super exciting. All right, well, that's the perfect news to end on, I think.
Yes. Well, Gretchen, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
This is my happy place. Really enjoyed talking to you. It's always really fun to talk to somebody who knows about books and horses, and that is my people. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Well, it's been an utter honor, and we're so lucky to have you. Thanks.
Bye.